Why would an American heart surgeon, trained in the brightest hospitals of Boston and New York, send his only daughter to study medicine in a country he once called Third World? Why are quiet emails passing between polished suburban kitchens and campuses in Manila, Cebu, Iloilo, Baguio parents with Ivy League diplomas suddenly circling schools they used to ignore? In lecture halls where American professors once warned, "Be careful with foreign degrees, something unexpected is happening," their own colleagues are whispering, "Have you looked at the Philippines?" Tonight, we follow one man who laughed at that idea, a man who believed real medicine belonged to the West, to white coats under cold fluorescent light. Yet the story you are about to hear does not begin in Harvard, but in a ward lit by warm, golden lamps in Manila, where a different kind of healing is quietly teaching the world a lesson. In Boston, the morning light always arrived in a precise, almost sterile rhythm. Dr. Michael Carter had long trusted that rhythm, the quiet hum of machines, the steady pulse of a heart monitor, the gleam of a surgical scalpel under white light. Order, accuracy, perfection, these were his gods. For 30 years, he had lived by the same commandments. Trust data, dismiss emotion, and never confuse faith with medicine. He was, by every measure, successful. His office overlooked the Charles River, his lectures filled auditoriums, and his name appeared in medical journals read across America. At conferences, when someone mentioned global medicine, he would smile politely, that practiced, diplomatic kind of smile that meant irrelevant. Once, at a panel in Geneva, he even joked, "In the developing world, they still mix prayer with medicine. Here, we have the science." Laughter followed. And yet, a faint shadow passed through him, the echo of something his mentor had once said when he was still a young intern. "Michael, a surgeon without humility can heal a body, but never a person." He had brushed it aside then. But sometimes, in the quiet after midnight rounds, when the city fell silent and he could hear his own heart beating, that sentence returned uninvited, unyielding. It was a rainy February morning when the letter arrived. A thick envelope stamped University of Santo Tomas, Manila. His daughter, Anna, had applied for an international exchange program without telling him. He tore it open and frowned. Accepted into the Faculty of Medicine and Surgery, University of Santo Tomas, Philippines. He reread it, his lips tightening. "Philippines?" he murmured. The word carried years of preconceptions, crowded hospitals, tropical diseases, students memorizing outdated textbooks. He had once supervised a Filipino nurse, kind and diligent, but in his mind, not trained to the standard. That bias had stayed, fossilized, and unexamined. When Anna came home that evening, drenched from the rain, he confronted her. "You applied to study there?" "Yes, Dad," she said quietly. "It's a short-term immersion medical outreach in Cebu. I want to see how medicine feels outside the lab." He sighed, almost amused. "Anna, feelings don't save lives. Skill does." She met his gaze, unafraid. "Maybe. But sometimes people die even when skill isn't enough." It was the first time she had ever challenged him about his work. He wanted to argue, to crush the naive idealism of youth with the logic of a lifetime. But instead, he turned away and muttered, "Go if you want. Just don't expect to learn anything real there." The following month, he received an invitation of his own, a keynote in Singapore on cardiac robotics. On his itinerary, a 2-day stop in Manila for a U.S. ASEAN medical cooperation meeting. He hesitated, then accepted. Perhaps, he thought, he would surprise Anna, see this program she was so drawn to, and gently remind her where true medicine resides. But nothing in Boston could have prepared him for what he saw in those humid streets. Manila was alive in a way that unsettled him, chaotic, human, and impossibly tender. The hospitals were crowded, yes, the equipment often old, but the eyes of the doctors burned with a calm intensity he hadn't seen in years. At every bedside, he heard murmured prayers, not desperate, but steady, as if each one stitched a thread of hope through the room. He attended a student clinic in Cebu the next day just to observe. The medical students were young, many in worn shoes and faded coats, yet when they spoke to patients, they knelt, not out of ritual, but respect. Before each consultation, they would whisper, "Lord, Guide my hands. At first, he felt a quiet irritation. This wasn't medicine, it was sentiment. But then he saw something that caught him off guard. A boy with a chest infection clutching the hand of a student nurse who smiled and said softly, "Don't worry, child. God heals through us." And in that moment, the boy's breathing slowed. Dr. Carter found himself unable to look away. Something deep within him, the part that once believed in wonder, flickered again. That night, in his hotel room, he opened his laptop to prepare for the Singapore presentation, but the slides blurred. In their place, his mind replayed the sound of laughter from the clinic, the scent of antiseptic mixed with candle wax, and the echo of a prayer spoken not from fear, but conviction. He realized, reluctantly, that what he had witnessed was not ignorance. It was integration. Science and soul, hand and heart, precision and presence. For the first time in years, Dr. Michael Carter could not name the feeling inside him. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was humility. Quietly returning home, he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. The verse lingered on a hospital wall he had passed earlier that day, painted by a student nurse with careful strokes. He had smiled at its innocence then. Now, he wasn't sure if it was innocence or truth. The morning light in Cebu arrived softly, as if hesitant to disturb the stillness that rested over the small hospital on the hill. The sun broke through the mist in golden shafts that touched the tiled floor, the scent of salt and rain lingering from the night before. Dr. Michael Carter stood at the gate, hands in his pockets, watching the world move at a slower, quieter rhythm. He told himself he had come only to observe, to prove that this place, this developing hospital, had little to teach him. Yet something in the silence unsettled him. The city he came from, the clean corridors of Boston General, the precision and perfection of it all, it suddenly felt distant, almost hollow. Inside, the hallways were narrow, their walls painted the color of faded cream. Electric fans hummed. Nurses in simple uniforms walked quickly but not hurriedly. There was a gentleness in the air, a quiet order that seemed to breathe on its own. He passed an open ward where a dozen patients lay on narrow beds. A nurse stood at the center, her hands clasped behind her back, smiling as she checked each patient. She carried no clipboard, no tablet, only a small rosary around her wrist. Her name tag read, Sister Maria de la Cruz. He paused when she stopped beside an old man, frail and shaking. She knelt slightly, opened the lunch she was carrying, and tore her bread in half. "Here, Lolo," she said softly. "You need to eat." The man hesitated, as if unworthy of the offering, but she pressed the food into his hand and smiled. "Please, Po." The old man whispered a thank you that trembled between gratitude and disbelief. Carter watched from the doorway. In Boston, lunch was a break between procedures. Here, it was communion. Something in him shifted, almost imperceptibly. When she turned and saw him, she smiled, as if recognizing an old friend. "You must be the visiting doctor." "Yes," he said. His voice felt oddly small. "Just observing." "Then observe closely," she replied. "Sometimes the smallest things are what heal." He did not understand what she meant, but her words stayed with him all afternoon. The way she spoke with warmth that carried no pride, no performance, reminded him of his wife, long gone now, whose hands used to hold his face after long shifts and whisper, "Michael, remember they're people, not puzzles." That night, he sat at his desk in the small dormitory room. The fan spun lazily overhead, the window open to the night breeze. On a piece of hospital stationery, he wrote one line, "They have less, yet they give more." Why does that feel like medicine, too? 2 days later, he joined a group of medical students on an outreach trip to a coastal barrio outside the city. The road wound through rice fields, then through narrow streets where children waved at the passing van. When they arrived, the sea stretched out before them vast, silver under the morning sun. The clinic was nothing more than an open-air church hall. Plastic chairs served as waiting benches. The walls were covered with hand-painted verses. "God is the strength of my heart." Patients were already waiting, mothers holding babies, fishermen with calloused hands, an old woman clutching a small cross. Carter looked around, uneasy. There were no monitors, no sterilized rooms, no electronic charts, only people. He saw his daughter, Anna, wearing a white coat that was too large for her hair tied back, her face glowing with sweat and sunlight. She was kneeling beside a small boy, showing him how to breathe through a stethoscope. "Listen," she said softly. "That's your heart, Anak. It's strong. It's God's rhythm." The boy laughed and pressed the cold metal to his chest again, fascinated by the sound of his own life. Carter felt something tighten in his throat. He had taught her the science of the heart valves, arteries, chambers, but never the wonder of it. That simple joy in hearing it beat. Later, while he observed the makeshift consultation tables, the electricity went out. The ceiling fans stopped, the lights dimmed, and a heavy silence settled over the room. For a moment, the heat grew unbearable. Then, from the corner, a young nurse began to sing. Her voice was soft at first, almost uncertain. "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." The melody floated through the air like a breeze, fragile yet full. Another voice joined in, then another, until the entire room, students, nurses, even patients, sung together. The child who had been coughing began to hum. An old woman clasped her hands. Someone began to cry. Dr. Carter stood frozen. He had spent his life believing that healing was chemistry, anatomy, procedure, never song. Yet here it was, healing in harmony, medicine wrapped in prayer. The words of Psalm 147:3 filled the space, soft but undeniable, and he felt the sound pass through him like light through glass. He closed his eyes. The verse echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he did not argue with it. He let it be. When the power returned and the hymn faded, the room remained luminous, as if the light had stayed in their voices. He realized, standing there, that this was not superstition. It was survival, not the kind measured in machines, but the kind that gives people reason to keep breathing. That evening, the sky over the coast turned the color of bronze. Dr. Carter sat on a bench outside the chapel, watching fishermen mend their nets. A janitor approached a man in his 50s, small-framed, his face weathered by sun and sea. He held a broom in one hand, a rosary in the other. "You're the American doctor," the man said kindly. "Yes," Carter replied. "Just visiting." The man nodded. "My wife died here 5 years ago. Cancer." He paused, looking out toward the water. The doctors couldn't save her, but they prayed with her. She died smiling. Carter didn't know how to respond. The man's words were simple, but they struck deep. "Maybe healing is not always about staying alive," the janitor added quietly. Something inside Carter broke open, then a crack in the shell he had built around grief. His wife's face flashed before him. The hospital room, the sterile light, the way he had stood beside her bed holding not her hand, but her chart. He had told her everything that medicine could do, and nothing that love could. She had died without hearing him pray. He looked at the janitor, this stranger who spoke like a prophet, and felt ashamed. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Not sure for whom." The man smiled gently. "Don't be. God has many ways of teaching the same lesson. Some just take longer to learn." He bowed slightly, then walked away, leaving the scent of candle wax and sea breeze behind. Inside the chapel, Anna was kneeling with a few other students, her eyes closed, lips moving in silent prayer. Sister Maria stood nearby, her hand resting on the shoulder of a patient who had come to give thanks. The flicker of candles lit their faces serene, focused, radiant. Dr. Carter stood in the doorway, afraid to move. The air was thick with stillness, but it wasn't heavy. It was alive. The chapel walls seemed to breathe with them, every flame swaying in rhythm with their words. He suddenly felt like an intruder in a sacred space, a man who had spent his life studying the heart, but had never once opened his own. He took a slow breath. The scent of incense mingled with salt. Outside, the waves kept whispering against the rocks. He thought of the patients he had treated, hundreds, maybe thousands, and how many of them had left his table cured, but not comforted. He realized then that medicine could extend life, but only love could could give it meaning. The next morning, as he prepared to leave for Manila, Sister Maria found him by the hospital gate. "You're going back?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "For now." She nodded. "Then take this." She handed him a small wooden cross carved from coconut shell. "When you forget what healing means, hold this for a moment. It might remind you." He looked at her at the lines of peace around her eyes and said quietly, "You have no machines here. Yet your patients, they smile more than mine." She answered, "Because they are seen, doctor. Sometimes that's all people need to begin healing." He slipped the cross into his pocket. It was light, but it felt heavy with meaning. On the flight back, clouds drifted like mountains below him. He stared through the window, the horizon fading into gold. Anna sat beside him, asleep, her head resting against the glass. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, under his breath, he whispered, "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." The words felt strange on his tongue, both foreign and familiar. They were no longer a verse. They were a heartbeat. He thought of the nurse sharing her bread, the hymn that filled the dark room, the janitor's quiet faith. 3 encounters, 3 moments that had undone everything he believed about medicine, about mastery, about himself. In each of them, something invisible had reached him, not doctrine, not dogma, but grace. It had slipped past his intellect, past his pride, and found the fragile place where he was still human. As the plane descended toward Manila, the clouds broke open and light poured through. The city below shimmered, a patchwork of roofs and rivers in motion. He closed his eyes, letting the light wash over him. He knew now that what he had witnessed in the Philippines wasn't a lesser form of medicine. It was a fuller one that remembered that to heal a wound, you must first touch it with compassion. In the stillness of that descent, Dr. Michael Carter, the man who once mocked prayer, felt a prayer rise within him. It was wordless, only breath. But perhaps that was enough. When they landed, Anna woke and smiled sleepily. "Home," she murmured. He looked at her and shook his head gently. "No," he said. "Not yet, but maybe we're getting closer." She frowned, not understanding, then laughed softly and leaned on his shoulder. The sunlight streamed through the cabin window, spilling across their hands. He turned toward it, watching how the light moved, slow, sacred, alive. And somewhere deep within him, he heard again the faint echo of the psalm that had followed him from the ward to the sea to the sky above the clouds. "He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds." The words no longer felt like something he had heard. They felt like something he had become. He did not yet know that the true test of that verse, the breaking point of both faith and flesh, awaited him just ahead. But as the plane touched down, he smiled quietly to himself, knowing that even in the valley of unknowing, grace had already begun its work. The road from Tagaytay down toward Manila curled like a ribbon through mist and rain. It was late afternoon, the sky the color of bruised pearl, the clouds hanging low over the ridge as if the earth itself were holding its breath. In the front seat, Anna had rolled the window down just enough to let in the mountain air. Her notebook lay open on her lap, pages filled with cramped handwriting and small sketches of hospital beds, candle flames, and smiling faces from Cebu. "You're too quiet," she said, glancing sideways at her father. He kept his hands steady on the wheel, eyes fixed on the curve ahead. "Just thinking," he answered. "About surgeries," she teased. "Or about jeepneys and Psalm 147. He exhaled softly. "About the things I didn't see. Not really." She smiled, the way only a daughter can when she has watched her father's armor crack without gloating. "You looked with your eyes," she said. "Now you're starting to look with the rest of you." He shook his head with a faint, rueful smile. "I used to think that kind of talk was sentimental. And now, he admitted quietly, "I'm not so sure." The first drops of rain tapped against the windshield, gentle and scattered. The road curved again. Wipers began their metronomic sweep, opening and closing brief windows of clarity. The air grew slick, the world reduced to wet asphalt and the red glow of a truck's taillights ahead. Anna closed her notebook and traced a finger over one of her own scribbled lines. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. Dad, she said softly, when I watched them in Cebu, when I heard them pray over every patient, like each one mattered to heaven, I thought, if I ever become a doctor, I want that. Not just the skill, the way they love. You'll have the skill, he said. You already see more than most. And you? She asked, tilting her head. What will you take back? He opened his mouth to answer, but the world in front of him changed in an instant. A branch, heavy with rain, lay fallen across the narrow lane. The truck ahead jerked, swerving sharply to avoid it. Tires screamed against soaked asphalt. The truck's rear swung wide, crossing the center line. There was no time for calculation, no space for clinical detachment. His hands turned the wheel. The car skidded. The sound of twisting metal shattered the air. In the frozen fraction of a second before impact, he heard his daughter suck in a breath and whisper, half conscious, half prayer, "He heals the brokenhearted." Then sound collapsed into a single brutal crack, and the world went black. When he surfaced, it was to fluorescent light, and the antiseptic smell that had always meant control, certainty, command. But this time, it felt cruel. His head throbbed, his arm burned. Something constricted his chest. He tried to sit up. Pain flared hot. A hand pressed gently against his shoulder. "Sir, please lie still," a voice said. "A nurse, Filipino, calm." He swallowed. "My daughter," he rasped. "Anna, where is she?" "She was brought in with you," the nurse answered. "She is in surgery now. Stable, but critical. We are doing everything we can." He had said those words himself 1,000 times. They had always sounded precise, professional, sufficient. Now they detonated inside his ribs like something merciless, stable, critical. "Everything we can." "How long?" he whispered. "Not long. Please rest. We will update you." They moved him to a bed in a corner of the trauma ward. He did not rest. Every beep of a monitor, every hurried footstep in the hall, every muffled order beyond the curtain became a thread in a tightening net of fear. He stared at the ceiling tiles and remembered all the times he had stood at the foot of a bed and explained outcomes, percentages, risks, odds, as if life were an equation that could be balanced if you pressed hard enough on the right variables. Now he had nothing. No control, no scalpel, only the knowledge that his only child was on the other side of a wall under someone else's hands. He slipped his uninjured hand over his eyes and found, to his shame, that it trembled. A memory surged. Anna as a little girl, asleep in his old armchair, a children's Bible open on her chest. His wife smiling, saying, "She prays for your patients, you know." His own dismissive reply, "They don't need prayer. They need competent surgeons." He heard his own arrogance echo in the sterile air and almost gagged on it. The curtain lifted. A nurse stepped in, the same one who had spoken to him in the first minutes. Her eyes were weary, but there was that same unmistakable kindness he'd been seeing everywhere since Cebu. "Sir," she said, "your blood type matches your daughter's. We are short in the bank. Would you be willing to donate?" "Now," he said, voice cracking. "Take all you need." The procedure itself was rote. He had overseen it countless times. Needle, tube, bag filling slowly with dark red. This time, he watched every drop as if it were a confession. It felt like penance, as if years of distance were being drawn out of his veins. "She's young," the nurse said gently. "She is strong." He wanted to ask her to promise, but he could see in her face she was too honest for false assurances. Night came and deepened. Rain whispered against the windows. The hospital corridors glowed a dim, perpetual dawn. He was moved into a wheelchair and left near the waiting area outside the operating room. Through the small window in the door, he could see shadows moving, green gowns, gloved hands, light on metal. He knew the language of that choreography by heart. He could read tension in the speed of a nurse's steps, in the angle of a surgeon's shoulders. He read all of it now and felt as if his organs were being slowly crushed. Somewhere, a child cried. Somewhere else, someone laughed too loudly to hide fear. A figure approached and sat down beside him. "You should drink something," she said, setting a cup of tea on the table near his hand. He looked up and recognized her. Sister Maria, the nurse from Cebu. Her presence here, in this Manila hospital, felt impossible and inevitable at once. "I can't," he muttered. "Then let it sit," she replied softly. "It will keep you company." He tried to breathe normally, failed. "She's all I have," he said abruptly, his voice raw. "If I lose her..." Sister Maria's gaze did not flinch. "When my brother died," she answered. After a moment, "I stopped praying. I thought faith had failed me. But an old priest told me, faith is not the shield that keeps the arrow away. It is the hand that holds you when it strikes." I did not like that answer, but it stayed. He let out a bitter sound that was almost a laugh. "I don't know how to do this. I spent my life telling people not to depend on miracles. Now, I find myself begging for one," she finished gently. He looked away. "If there is a God, he has every reason to ignore me." She considered him with quiet attention. "Sometimes," she said, "what breaks us is what God uses to open us." The sentence fell between them like something fragile and sharp. He shook his head slowly. "I taught my daughter that medicine is science, not superstition. That what they do here," he gestured vaguely, as if encompassing candles, hymns, whispered prayers, "is beautiful but unnecessary. Now she's in their hands, and I don't even know how to pray for her without feeling like a hypocrite." Sister Maria placed her hand over his bandaged arm. It was a simple touch, human, steady. "You just prayed," she said. "You asked. That's where it always begins." He stared at her hand. It anchored him. "There is a chapel downstairs," she added quietly. "You don't have to say anything. Just sit. Let the silence do what it was made to do." He almost refused. Pride rose instinctively, the old armor waking. Then he pictured Anna on that operating table, and the armor cracked. He nodded once. She wheeled him down a short corridor, past sleeping relatives on plastic chairs, past a poster listing hospital rules, past a window where dawn was still a rumor. The chapel door opened with a soft click. Inside, the room was small. A wooden cross hung on the front wall. One candle burned beneath it, its flame bending and straightening in the draft. The air smelled faintly of wax and something floral. She left him there. Dr. Michael Carter sat in the last row, hands resting uselessly in his lap. He looked at the candle. It seemed too little to push back the weight of what he felt. "How do I start?" he whispered, not sure to whom he was speaking. He remembered patients' families he had watched from a distance, kneeling, clutching rosaries, mouthing words he'd silently pitied. He remembered thinking, "They cling to illusion because they cannot accept data." Now, the only illusion seemed to be the idea that he had ever been in control of anything. He lowered his head. Nothing came. No formula. No eloquent confession. Only a long, shuddering breath and a few broken words. "If you're there, don't take her, please. And if I've been wrong..." He stopped, because the rest tangled in his throat. He was not bargaining. He didn't know how. He sat that way for a long time. At some point he realized Sister Maria was near the front, kneeling, her voice a low murmur. He heard her reading, in English now, as though she wanted him to understand. "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." Psalm 147:3. The candle flame trembled. The words hung in the air, gentle and unhurried, but they did not feel gentle. They felt like an incision, brokenhearted, wounds. He thought of his wife, of the way he had watched numbers on a monitor the night she died instead of watching her face. He thought of Anna, who had grown up praying alone because her father would not kneel beside her. He thought of every time he had cut into a chest and refused to acknowledge the mystery that heart kept beating at all. "Heals," he repeated silently. "Binds. Not perfects. Not explains. Binds." He felt his chest tighten, and then something within him gave way, not with violence, but with the slow surrender of ice under warm water. His eyes filled, his shoulders shook. He let his hands fall open on his knees. "If those words are true," he whispered hoarsely, "then they have to be true for me too, for her. Please, bind what I've broken, heal what I cannot fix." It was clumsy. It was late. But it was real. The silence that followed was not empty. It wrapped around him, not as an answer, but as an acknowledgement. The candle burned steadily now, its earlier flicker settling into a quiet, unwavering flame. He did not know how long he remained there. Time loosened. The dark outside softened to blue, then to the pale gray that precedes dawn. Light crept across the chapel floor in gentle bands. Breath slowed. The raw edge inside him dulled to something deeper, quieter. He rose slowly, every muscle aching, but his steps held a new steadiness. The verse moved with him. No longer a phrase he'd heard in a song, but a thread woven through his own unraveling. He heals the brokenhearted. He binds up their wounds. When he returned to the ward, the corridor was washed in a thin, gold morning light. Nurses walked with softer shadows. A doctor in green scrubs approached him. Young. Filipino. Eyes marked with fatigue and a hint of relief. "Dr. Carter." "Yes," he managed. "Your daughter made it through the night," the man said. "There was significant trauma, but the bleeding is controlled. Her vitals are improving. She is not out of danger, but she is stable. The surgery went as well as we could hope." For a moment, he could not breathe. Then, the air rushed in all at once. He gripped the back of the chair beside him. "Can I see her?" "Only briefly." He moved down the hallway like a man learning to walk again. The room where Anna lay was quiet. Machines hummed softly. Lines traced the cadence of her heart on a small screen. Her face was pale, her hair matted, but her chest rose and fell. That small rise and fall was the most beautiful motion he had ever seen. He took her hand. It was warm beneath the IV tape. He bowed his head over it. "Anna," he whispered, voice breaking, "I am so sorry. For everything I did not see, for everything I refused to believe. You came here because you saw the soul in medicine before I did. You trusted this place. You trusted a God I would not name. And now I see." Her fingers twitched, the faintest response. Tears blurred his vision. He did not look up. He could not bear to lose the feel of her hand. Outside in the corridor, someone began to hum, barely audible at first. A melody he recognized. The same hymn from the clinic when the power died. The same verse. He heals the broken-hearted and binds up their wounds. The sound slipped through the doorway, wrapped around the machines, threaded itself through the sterile air and his shattered composure. He let it wash over him. He did not resist. A soft knock. Sister Maria stood at the threshold, holding a small candle in a glass cup. "For her," she said. "For you." He took it and set it beside the monitor. Its flame was gentle, dwarfed by plastic and metal, and yet it drew the eye more than any screen. "I don't know how to go back," he admitted quietly. She shook her head. "You don't go back," she answered. "You go on, different." He looked at his daughter, at the candle, at the verse carved now into the secret places of his mind. The storm had not been erased. The scars would not vanish. But something else had entered the room with the morning, a stillness that did not depend on outcomes. He stayed by her side as the day unfolded. He watched the monitors, yes, but for the first time he did not worship them. His attention was on the small weight of her hand and the fragile grace of each breath. In that quiet, the clamor inside him receded. By evening, the sky outside the hospital windows had turned amber. The candle's flame burned steadily on the bedside table. The torrent of fear had slowed to a deep, reflective current. Exhaustion settled over him like a blanket, but beneath it, unmistakably, there was peace. Not triumph. Not certainty. Peace. As he closed his eyes in the dim light, still holding his daughter's hand, the words of Psalm 147:3 rose once more, not as desperate pleading now, but as confirmation of what had already begun. He heals the broken-hearted. He binds up their wounds. The valley had not vanished, but he was no longer walking it alone. The morning of her recovery came quietly, almost shyly. The Manila sun rose pale and warm through the hospital blinds, scattering ribbons of gold across the white bedsheets. The machines were still humming, but their rhythm now matched something peaceful, steady, unhurried, alive. Dr. Michael Carter had not left the ward in 3 days. He sat by the window, unshaven, tired, but changed. The air around him no longer carried the edge of fear. It had softened into reverence. He watched his daughter stir beneath the blanket, her eyelids fluttering, the faintest smile forming when she realized where she was. "Dad," she whispered, voice hoarse but light. He moved closer, unable to speak at first. His hand found hers, the same gesture that had once felt foreign, now as natural as breath. "I'm here," he said. She smiled faintly. "You look terrible," he laughed through his tears. "So do you." They stayed like that for a long while, in silence, father and daughter, scientist and believer, two halves of a heart learning the same lesson in different ways. When the nurse entered to change the IV line, she said gently, "She's healing well. The worst is over." Dr. Carter nodded. The phrase, "she's healing," echoed differently now. It no longer meant tissue repair or successful grafts. It meant wholeness returning, light filtering through the cracks of something once broken. He looked out the window. The city below was waking jeepneys weaving through traffic, street vendors lifting tarps, children walking to school in pressed uniforms. Manila pulsed with life, chaotic and sacred all at once. Somewhere in that noise, a church bell rang. He closed his eyes. The sound reminded him of Cebu, of candlelight and salt air, of Sister Maria's steady voice reading the psalm that had changed everything. "He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds." He repeated it under his breath, not as repetition, but as gratitude. Every syllable was alive. 2 weeks later, the hospital released Anna. The doctors insisted she rest before flying home. Father and daughter moved into a small guest house near the bay, its windows facing the sea. Each morning, they sat together on the veranda, she with her tea, he with his silence. The light over Manila Bay changed constantly, shifting from gold to white to the deep indigo of evening. One morning, Anna spoke first. "Do you think you'll ever go back?" He looked at her, unsure what she meant. "To Boston," she said. "To the same life." He considered the question carefully. "The hospital will still be there," he said. "But I think I'll go back differently." "How?" He smiled. "With less certainty, more care. And maybe," he hesitated, "a prayer before every operation." She laughed softly. "That will surprise them." "Maybe it should," he said. "They've forgotten that healing isn't just anatomy." They sat in comfortable silence. The breeze carried the smell of the ocean. Below them, a group of nursing students walked toward the clinic, laughing, their white uniforms glowing in the light. "Do you think," Anna asked quietly, "we were meant to come here?" "Yes," he said without hesitation, "but not for the reasons we thought." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "You always said the world was a set of systems, circulation, metabolism, equations." He smiled. "It still is. But now I know that grace runs through them too." He reached into his pocket and took out the small wooden cross Sister Maria had given him in Cebu. Its surface was worn smooth from his hands. "I used to think this was just a symbol," he said, holding it up. "Now I see it's a map of every wound that love has ever healed." Anna took the cross and turned it over in her palm. "Then maybe healing is just love learning how to stay." He looked at her, the sun catching her hair, the same warm gold he had seen in the hospital candlelight, and realized that somewhere along this journey, their roles had reversed. She had become the teacher. That evening, they returned to the hospital one last time, not as patients, but to visit the chapel. The candle he had lit weeks ago was still there, its wax melted low but its flames steady. Sister Maria was waiting. "She's stronger," she said, smiling. "She is," he replied. "And so am I." They stood before the cross in silence. Then, softly, he said, "Thank you for seeing what I couldn't." She shook her head. "I only reminded you. The seeing was yours." He stepped closer to the altar. When I came here, I thought faith was a comfort for the powerless. Now I see it's the strength of the healer." Sister Maria nodded. "The world taught you medicine," she said, "but the Philippines taught you healing." He smiled, not out of pride, but recognition. "Yes," he said, "and that's a lesson I'll spend the rest of my life learning." That night, the city lights reflected across the bay like thousands of candles. Father and daughter sat on the veranda again, listening to the tide roll in. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" Anna asked softly. "She would," he said, "but not because we survived. Because we finally understood." "Understood what?" He looked out toward the horizon, where the last light of day met the first shadow of night. "That healing was never something we created," he said. "It was something we were allowed to share." They sat in silence as the wind moved through the palms. The candle from the chapel burned beside them, its flame steady despite the breeze. In the distance, the sound of church bells drifted across the water. It was the hour of vespers, the prayer of gratitude. He bowed his head. Not in ritual, but in reverence. "Thank you," he whispered to the nurses who had prayed, to the strangers who had given blood, to the God he had spent a lifetime denying, to the daughter who had believed for them both. The city glimmered. The sea breathed. Somewhere beyond, unseen, another day began its slow ascent. And in that stillness, he knew the verse would remain with him forever, not as a memory, but as rhythm, the quiet pulse beneath all things. He heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. He leaned back, closing his eyes, the sound of the tide matching the beat of his heart. Peace filled the space where ambition had once lived. When he finally spoke again, it was barely above a whisper. "May the light that healed us," he said, "find everyone who is still waiting for dawn."